The electricity system is going through a revolution, whether people like it or not. And it's going to have some victims and some winners. It's driven by a powerful combination of technology change, of environmental mandate, of the market growth. The essence of it, however, is that companies that cling to the old ways are going to fail. And we've seen this in Germany, where they've lost more than 75% of their market cap, the big utilities there. Nobody wanted that to happen. But it was a consequence of all these things coming together. What I want to talk about today is dramatically expanding renewable energy and strategies to get there, including regulatory strategies. And I would invite you to interrupt at any point. And I do have a slideshow here. This is just, oops, I guess I'm a little fast here. Just 3 parts: the opportunity, the challenges, and some solutions. Let me begin with an observation that I think you're all familiar with. The dramatic changes in energy technology, both renewable energy and energy efficiency. So this is solar installs in the United States, grown tenfold in the last 4 years. It's been both driven by and enabled by a collapse of the price of photovoltaics, 80% drop in the price of PV systems in the last 5 years. Wind is down 58% in 5 years. Imagine an energy technology changing that quickly. This is global. In a 4-year period, global installations of photovoltaics went from 23 gigawatts to 135 gigawatts, and we're adding well beyond that now. So it's a real explosion. The total quantity of photovoltaics as a fraction of the global energy system is still small, although in some jurisdictions it's becoming big enough to become a real factor in power systems planning. And there's no limit to the growth. This is not like natural gas. The prices will go up and down. These prices will go down and stay down. And there's more room ahead. This is the learning curve for photovoltaics, and it's plotted on log scale there. Beautiful line. And you can see it started, oops, I went too fast once again. It's now below $1 a watt. They're selling panels for 68 cents a watt right now in parts of the world. I should add one more thing here that's important. It costs less than half as much to install PV panels in Germany as it does in the United States. And that's because of soft costs, permitting, finance, marketing, and things like that. 50% reduction is available between 2 industrialized countries. There's also fantastic innovation possibilities with balance of system. In fact, that's where the next wave of innovation has to happen, because these things are so cheap now that the panel cost is less than half of the cost of a PV system. I'm focusing on photovoltaics, but wind energy has gone through a similar learning curve, and it's not done by any means. I was up at GE Global Research, spent a day there learning about some of their new wind technologies, and this one came to mind during lunch. The cost of a windmill is steel, so it's huge towers, and they have to be sized for the peak gust when the blades are facing the wind, which will happen once in 5 years or once in 10 years or something like that, but obviously you don't want it to fall over. So at GE, they've learned to put, I can't remember if it's lasers or radar on it, and they can see the wind several hundred meters away, and so they can feather instantly. And that allows them to completely demask the tower, right? So they swapped a laser and a little bit of software and some control technology for all that steel. That's just one of many innovations they have on the shelves that are coming along. If you put it all together, below the line here are conventional conventional power sources with the capital costs in blue and the operating costs or fuel costs in gray. And you can see the ones above the line are a variety of renewable energy technologies, onshore wind, solar PV, and so on. And at the bottom are the conventional technologies. And basically, this race is now being won by renewable energy sources, which is pretty spectacular. Nobody in the U.S. is going to build, I don't know if I should say nobody. There will be very few new coal-fired power plants built in the U.S. from here on. There will be very few built in most of Western Europe. Last year, China put in more renewables than they did coal. Last year, global renewables expenditures exceeded fossil for new construction, right? So this is a transition point that's happening. There's a lot more in the horizon too. This is I think it's a 500 megawatt solar thermal plant. Those mirrors follow the sun and they aim on that tower that heats up oil, which runs a steam turbine What's interesting about this is it's more expensive than photovoltaics, but you can easily store the heat. It's very hard to store electricity. It's very easy to store heat, which means you can run those turbines for hours after the sun sets. And you could put a little gas turbine in and run it a little farther. So all of a sudden, you have a technology that changes the operating profile significantly of solar energy. And as the electricity system begins to value dispatchability and capacity, that may become economical. And again, this is really very much an immature technology. There's a lot of improvement could be had here. Offshore wind is much more expensive than onshore wind, but it blows a lot more offshore. And there are no neighbors. So you don't get the resistance. I think the UK, Ireland, Denmark are going to be leaders in this in time. And I predict this will be a big technology. It also not only blows more than it does onshore, but it blows at different times. So if you have both, you can integrate and have a smoother power supply curve, which is important. On the demand side, the revolution is every bit as big. These are positive energy houses. They produce more than they use. They're kind of ugly, but it's kind of cool. So net zero energy houses are happening. In California, driven by the best building code in the world, new houses use 80% less energy than pre-code houses. And they've established as an official goal, not a law yet, of net zero energy for all new residential construction by 2020. So that's kind of interesting. And you don't actually have to go to zero. You just have to go low on all these things. You still want to have these things hooked up to the grid on the whole. Although there's talk, I met with Steve Chu, our former Secretary of Energy recently, and he says within 3 years, there will be a one house size battery, about the size of a washing machine, for under $5,000. And you put the solar panels on top and the battery in the basement, you're off the grid. And if you can do the solar for $8,000 and the battery for $5,000 and be done with it, it's pretty interesting. So on the demand side, there's not only raw energy efficiency, and by the way, there's fantastic progress on industrial energy efficiency, residential energy efficiency in autos, which will be increasingly important with electrification. There's also this whole field of demand response, which is booming, which is basically the electricity system has always been built since it was started. The demand is whatever it is, and you dispatch that much generation in real time. Now you can say, well, let's dispatch demand just as we dispatch supply. And there are dozens of ways, probably hundreds of ways to do that. Electricity batteries are incredibly expensive right now. And if you added up all the batteries in the world, they would run the grid for 3 minutes, right? So we don't store electricity in any meaningful way. But in America, we have 100 million very large-scale batteries that we're not using. They're called houses. They're thermal batteries. And if you know it's going to be a hot day in Texas, and you know the wind's not going to blow, and those are two things you know 24 hours in advance, then pre-cool your buildings a little bit, right? Turn on the AC at 7 a.m. and run it till noon, maybe 1 or 2 degrees below where you normally would. And then from noon to 7 p.m., cycle it on and off, maybe 1 or 2 degrees higher than you would. And you've just displaced, if you do that with all the skyscrapers, you've just displaced a dozen power plants. And it costs approximately zero, because all you needed to do that is a little bit of software, some radios, and some switches, which are all incredibly cheap, right? So there are dozens of ways to dispatch demand. One of the other ones we talked about at lunch is hot water heaters. Your hot water heater stores heat. It doesn't care when it's on and when it's off. But the power system cares intensely what the demand is when the supply is variable. So just hook them up. And again, switches, radios, software is all it takes. So there's a lot going on here. You've probably seen these Nest thermostats. You put them in, you get a 15% reduction in your energy use, just because it figures out when you're home and when you're not home and what the weather is. If you use them as dispatch devices, these things sell for $250. The economic value in California to the utility of one of these is $750. But if and only if they're being used to dispatch against variable supply, right? And it's invisible or close to invisible to the customer. Nest has a program called Rush Hour Rewards. Excuse me. You sign up, and they give you a little bit of money every month. And they, within a comfort envelope, adjust the heat of your house a little differently than you would. but a very narrowly defined comfort window. And you save quite a bit of money. And again, you pay them for the switch and you pay them for the radio. All they have to do is software. And they can sell that service for megabucks to the utility because it's a lot cheaper than turning on and off power plants. Okay, I'm going to speed up. When the world goes from about 25% renewable energy to 50 or 60 or 70% renewable energy, you have to operate the power system in a fundamentally different way. A lot of problems creep in. The instinctive reaction most people have to variable power sources is, let's have batteries, let's have electricity storage. But as I said at the beginning, batteries are really expensive. Here's how the problem works. This is California's total demand. It's about 7 times as big as Ireland's over the course of a day in January. And that's projected wind supply, and that's projected solar supply. I actually think those numbers will be quite a bit higher, but let's go with this for a minute. The net that has to be produced with conventional, including hydro, nuclear, and fossil, is that blue curve right there. And that blue curve looks different than the green curve. And the key differences are you have to shut down 1 Ireland's worth of electricity in a 2-hour period, and you have to crank up 2.5 Ireland's worth of electricity in another 2-hour period at the end of the day. And big power plants hate to be turned off, and they hate to be turned on. They're really happy at a constant speed and a constant temperature. So you have to deploy a series of technologies and a series of policy strategies to solve that problem. There's some more problems with the power system. I think the grid here is in better shape than in the US, but this is a grade that was given by the civil engineers to the US grid, D+. We have been frozen from investing in the grid for more than 2 decades because of regulatory uncertainty. So we're way behind. And you probably remember when we had our hurricane, the whole East Coast was blacked out. Some parts of states for weeks on end. The grid's extremely vulnerable to weather right now. Electricity demand is flat or dropping in most rich countries now, even with electric cars, even with more computers. And it will drop precipitously, or it'll drop more and more as new technologies on the demand side come along. So if you have less demand and increased infrastructure investments, your unit prices have to go up to pay for it. At the same time, most power companies either had a regulated return, but that's gone. It's being replaced by the wholesale market. The wholesale market is such that you earn very little money most of the day, and then when the power prices peak, you earn a lot of money, and then you earn very little money. But along comes wind and solar, and they have zero marginal cost. And they are eating a hole in those rich hours. And this is what's killed the German utilities. They used to sell power, for 20 cents a kilowatt hour. I should translate all that into euros, I know, but you work it out. And then the market clearing price is 0 or negative. So it's just gutted them. So, and then there's a series of environmental regulations. These are 2 Republican presidents signing the first Clean Air Act and Clean Air Act amendments. As you probably know, President Obama has promulgated regulations limiting CO2 per kilowatt hour from existing power plants. So if you're a utility executive and you're facing new technologies, you're facing markets that are unfamiliar, you're facing declining sales, you're facing increasing fixed costs, and you're facing much more complicated system balancing challenges, that's kind of uncomfortable. So what do you do? The idea we've been pushing is that consumers don't care about electrons, and they don't care about rates and tariffs. They care about affordability, which is bills, not rates. They care about reliability, and they care about environmental performance. And so we've been pushing performance-based regulation, which is you give the utilities. Now, this works for vertically integrated utilities. It's a little more complicated in a system like you have in much of the EU. You give the utility a 5-year goal on each of these targets. And if they beat the goal, they make a lot of money. And if they fail to beat the goal, they lose money. And that's it. No more line-by-line dickering over this thing. Last year, California utilities invested $1 billion in energy efficiency at the behest of the Public Utilities Commissions. And the oversight cost $400 million for that billion. That's because it's a combat relationship between the utility saying, well, I did put insulation in the house, and here's how much it costs, and here's why it was reasonable, and here's how much energy it'll save, and therefore this is how much money I should make. And the public utilities commissioners, consumer advocates who says, well, maybe you could have bought it cheaper, or you dispatched 2 trucks when you only should have dispatched 1 truck. It's a silly way to run a business, but it's the way a lot of businesses still run, at least in the US. So performance-based regulation is a way to wipe the slate clean on all of that stuff. Some of the elements that utilities, the tools utilities can use to win this. This is that demand curve where I've just blown up the y-axis here. If you invest in transmission, you can chop off your peak demand very significantly, and you can increase your supply. If you have demand response chops off the peak, sorry. Transmission increases supply because you wheel it in from other regions. If you use natural gas for what it should be used for, which is a premium fuel for quick dispatch, you can ramp up very quickly. If you optimize the whole system over geographies, over a variety of renewable energy technologies which have different characteristics, if you use fossil fuel in an optimum way, and if emphatically you work the demand side, then this problem of steeply dropping, shutting off a bunch of power plants, and then steeply ramping them back up gets radically ameliorated. To give an example of that, this is an example in California where you can cut that problem in half for pennies. The National Renewable Energy Labs, which is America's premier national laboratory on renewable energy, created a model of the US grid and did an hour-by-hour simulation from now to 2050 with increasing fractions of renewable energy. And then they changed other parameters like the amount of transmission. And they found you can go to 80% renewables by 2050 with very little storage. So I thought that was a good news story. The trick is to use all of these things and then to optimize against the whole. In order to optimize against the whole, you need system aggregators, or you need somebody who can look at the whole system. So who is in charge of dispatching demand right now? Who are the aggregators? Who gets rewarded? If it's such a cheap way to handle the variability of wind, you have to create that function. And it was argument that utilities should do this. So the first step in this is back to performance-based regulation. Reward utilities for energy services, not for kilowatt hours. One approach to this is to give the utility, it's not what you charge the customer, but it's what you give the utility, $75 a month per house. That's it for 5 years. If they can supply energy services, that is to say super efficient lighting, super efficient buildings, super efficient refrigerators, and energy supply, and wheeled in power, for less than $75, they're going to make money. And if it costs more than $75, they're going to lose money. You still have to charge the customers on a variable basis, and then the regulator has to true that up. But that's just a very simple example of performance-based regulation. What's emphatically important here, though, is that people care about light and warmth, cold beer. They don't care about electrons. And so if the utility is in a volumetric business, they're going to sell as many electrons as they can. And that's the opposite of what we need to do to optimize the system. Okay. The second, and here again, the US flavor is quite different from the European flavor, but we've used renewable portfolio standards. 30 US states have them. We don't have much national energy policy in America, but we have a lot of state energy policy. And so this is driven not quite as fast as Ireland, but it's driven a lot of states to serious renewable energy. California has already signed every contract that it needs to be 33% renewables by 2020. So that's pretty soon. And the governor just announced a 50% renewables by 2030 target. And we supported another model with the National Renewable Energy Lab that says they can go to 55% renewables by 2030 with zero incremental cost compared to business as usual. So that's pretty breathtaking, or breath-giving. A third absolutely crucial step is to rethink rate structures. So California had a progressive rate structure in the sense that if you didn't use much electricity, you didn't pay much. If you use more, you pay more. And then it's a time of use thing too. So if you use electricity in the middle of the day, you pay a lot, 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And at night, it's maybe 2 cents. That rate design made sense for energy conservation and equity purposes. But then along comes me, or somebody like me, and puts solar on the roof, and I get to flip that rate structure around. It's a mirror. Net metering is the mirror image of rate design. So I get paid 30 cents a kilowatt hour all day, and I buy at 2 cents all night. So my electricity bill is about minus $100 a month right now. That obviously is only going to help people who own a house and can afford to put this on and can negotiate the contracts, right? So in Germany, they've got solar everywhere except apartment buildings, because you can't put solar on apartment buildings. So the renters are subsidizing the homeowners. It's reverse progressivism. That's why I say, so what you have to do, I like net metering because it created a solar explosion. It is not a viable business model long term. What you have to do is add up all the values that solar provides, subtract all the costs that it imposes on the systems, and set your rates accordingly. I speed up here. Actually, I'm close to the end here. I mentioned earlier allowing supply and demand to compete as equals. Almost nobody does this, but when they do, it's pretty impressive. The largest power pool in America is called the PJM power pool, 65 million customers. They needed capacity. They needed to make sure the lights stayed on. So they defined a market very carefully. So it's a capacity market. You will deliver so many megawatts for so many hours with such and such notice. And they let supply side and demand side bid against each other. And the demand cleaned the table. 80% cheaper average bid price compared to supply. And they've tested it. It works. And it's just the same thing of switching your air conditioners and your heaters on in ways that are a little different than you would otherwise. And so it's not surprising that it's cheaper. I think every power market, both raw power and capacity, should allow demand and supply side to compete against each other. Valuing fast on and off capabilities. A lot of deregulated electricity regimes do not have a capacity market, but society needs things that turn on and off quickly. And as I said earlier, the real value of natural gas is its ability to ramp up quickly. It's incredibly cheap to build a natural gas power plant. And if you're running it 200 hours a year, the carbon footprint is negligible, and it's dramatically easier and cheaper than a battery. But nobody's going to build a power plant that runs 200 hours a year because they can't get remunerated, even though society needs it, unless you build a smart, and there's dumb ways and smart ways to build capacity markets. The grid, every study on large-scale renewables argues you need a bigger and better grid, both smarter and with more physical capacity. That's tough. And then this is one more thing that we push pretty hard. It's very easy for regulators to inadvertently make it hard to finance important systems. And they do it all the time. In California, you can get your price for renewable energy. You can get a feed-in tariff in other parts of the world, but then you have trouble getting your siting, and you can't get a transmission line, and you can't negotiate a contract with the utility, or that it takes 2 years to negotiate a contract with the utility. And if you add up enough of these obstacles, the risk-reward ratio goes to hell. It gets very expensive. And so setting a renewables target is not per se enough. You have to think through all the obstacles a business would face in building large-scale renewables in order to get there. And then lastly, we have epic battles over siting renewable energy and transmission corridors and power plants in the US. And I think a lot of that could be avoided by designating some sites as red zones. You're just not going to go there no matter what because of wildlife considerations or views or whatever else. And some sites as green zones where you're going to get a permit within 60 days if you meet certain parameters. And then some sites as yellow where you just know it's going to be a long, ugly fight. So just clean it up. Make it easier. Red, yellow, green. It's not that hard. I'm going to wrap up with just a couple more slides. If you take this new paradigm, we're going to 50% renewables, we're going to 80% renewables. We're going to optimize the supply and the demand side together. We're going to pay utilities for the services they render, and those three services are affordability, reliability, and environmental performance. You can deliver that with performance-based regulation. We have a program called America's Power Plan, which has probably 15 papers and more than 200 utility regulatory experts together on it, walking through utility business models, distribution systems, transmission systems, and so forth. This is starting to evolve actually pretty quickly. I think California, New York has already issued a white paper. They're going to move completely in this direction. California, Minnesota, and Hawaii will be next in America. So I think within the next 2 years, we're going to see a lot of this put into practice. My last slide. Policymakers have to define their social goals carefully. That has to be translated into regulations, and there are ways to do that to minimize risk, but you want to reward performance, not investment. Utilities, and again, oops, a little fast, different here. Utilities should be given a clear system. They should know what the goal is. They should know what they have to do to get it, and then they should have a free run. Cannot get there with deeply complicated line-by-line overview. And that will give you these things. We've seen this done piecemeal all over, but never in one place altogether. So that's it.